Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. In a narrow street that descended toward the markets of Fatih, where the morning mist smelled faintly of salt and fig leaves, a boy could already tell time not by the muezzin's call, but by the scents rising from the bazaar. At first light came amber and sheep's wool, then later cumin, smoke, and the sweat of men unrolling bales of cloth. His hands, though still boyish, were often dusted yellow with turmeric from sorting sacks half his size. He liked that color best. Even when the dye would not wash away, it made his skin look touched by sunlight that never fully reached their cramped courtyard. He lived behind the shop of his master, an aging spice dealer who kept records in a ledger bound with cracked green leather. The old man rarely spoke, except to mutter prices or prayers. But he trusted the boy to fetch measurements, sweep away husks, and guard against the mice that nested behind the chests of pepper. The shop smelled of every land beyond the sea, though the boy had never seen beyond the domes and chimneys of the city. At times, he would stand by the door and imagine the caravans that brought their trade. Long lines of camels stepping across endless deserts, men with faces burned brick red by the wind, sacks tied with ropes black from travel. The boy's family lived not far away, in a single room visited more often by drafts than sunlight. His mother mended cloth. His father, once a porter, had grown weak from years of carrying stones for new mosques. Work was uncertain, and food arrived with the patience of a late guest. But the boy had work, and work meant some predictability. A place to return to every dawn, a handful of coins that smelled faintly of copper and cinnamon, a corner to sleep where the air was heavy yet safe. He learned to read numbers by counting the coins, and to measure time by the boiling of tea. The master, stern but not unkind, taught him the secret of trade, that scent was memory. "You can fool the eye," the old man once said, "but the nose remembers." It was the only wisdom the boy received that year, and he kept it close, thinking how each smell lingered differently. Saffron sweet and proud, cloves sharp and secretive, cardamom clean as washed linen. Perhaps, he thought, people were much the same. Sometimes on quiet evenings, when the lamps flickered in the drafts from the alley, he would sneak up to the shop's roof. There the city stretched in hums and murmurs, dogs barking near the docks, oars striking the water like uneven drumbeats, a far-off song rising from a tavern that the pious pretended not to hear. Smoke from hearths swirled like blue ribbons, and he liked to imagine each wisp carrying stories from another rooftop. From there, The world seemed both near and unreachable, a horizon stitched to his breath. The days followed one another steadily, marked by markets and mending, by bargained words exchanged under the wooden arches of the bazaar. He ran errands through crowded lanes, watched beggars argue with guards, and saw how the powerful spoke as though the air itself owed them space. It taught him caution, not from sermons or punishment, but from the quiet fear that too many eyes could turn a simple mistake into ruin. He learned to bow low when men in fine robes inspected the trade stalls, yet to keep his humor alive when speaking with other apprentices. Laughter, after all, cost nothing, and hid the tremor of worry better than silence. His small joys were humble and fiercely guarded. The first sip of tea sweetened with honey sent by a caravan from Damascus. The distant call of the night watchman warning of fire. The rare morning when the sea's wind blew cool enough to carry the fragrance of oranges from the Prince's Islands. He began to sense that life was an intricate balancing of these moments, brief reliefs tied together by labor. Nothing lasted long. Neither fear nor pleasure could be counted upon. Yet this uncertainty made each small comfort feel earned. Once, a street thief darted into their shop, pursued by guards. The boy froze, holding his breath as the man ducked behind a chest of ginger. The guards thundered past without seeing him. When the fugitive crept out again, trembling and cornered, the boy noticed he had dropped a single copper coin, likely all he had stolen. Without speaking, he placed it back into the man's palm. The thief hesitated a second, then disappeared into the crowd. The master saw nothing, but later that night the boy felt a warmth in his chest that he could not name. It was then he began to hide his kindness as carefully as the jewelers hid their gold, for kindness, he sensed, was a dangerous currency in such a city. Winter came hard. Frost formed on the jars inside the unheated shop. The spices clumped together, damp with the breath of the sea. The boys spent each evening striking flints to keep the brazier alive, watching the sparks leap like tiny fireflies. In those moments he thought of the caravans again, the endless motion of men who wandered from one hardship to another, finding purpose in their movement alone. Perhaps they, too, slept near fires that smelled faintly of pepper. Perhaps they dreamed of Istanbul as he dreamed of their deserts. The thought comforted him. Each man carried the promise of another life somewhere beyond reach. By spring he had grown into the rhythm of trade. Regular customers greeted him by name, and his master began to trust him with the scales. The city hummed louder when the winds turned warm. Fresh caravans arrived by land, ships by the straits. Traders shouted in half a dozen tongues. Perfumed dust rose from the sacks, turning the air rich and dizzying. Amid it all, the boy walked steady, counting measures aloud with the confidence of someone who had, at last, found his place among cents and numbers. Still, at night, he wondered what lay beyond the horizon. Once he asked his master if he had ever traveled as far as the lands where these spices grew. The old man shook his head and said only, "The farther the road, the lonelier the bargain." The boy did not yet understand, but he carried that sentence as he carried his ledgers, close to heart, neatly folded, waiting to be read when older. Years would pass before he realized that every trade was not only an exchange of goods, but of trust. that every pouch sealed with wax carried a story, and some stories could burn hotter than pepper. But for now, under the flicker of lamp smoke, he was still learning the language of spices, the slow grammar of patience and scent. And in that scented air, under roofs that creaked like old ships, the seed of a merchant's life quietly took root. Would you like the next chapter, Ash and Cardamom, to emphasize more on his emotional maturation and relationships, or focus primarily on the political and economic texture of his daily life in Istanbul? When morning came, the harbor opened like a restless eye. Ships waited in the haze, creaking, their ropes wet with dew. The spice stalls along the quay lifted their shutters to the rhythm of gulls, and the city exhaled its first breath of heat. Among the traders counting barrels and shouting weights, the young merchant moved with slow assurance. His hands now carried the steady calm of habit, his gestures practiced from years of barter. The boy who once swept dust for another man had grown into quiet possession of his own corner of the bazaar. The stall was modest, just wide enough for 3 shelves and 1 wooden chair, but the jars on display still caught the light and drew customers from the street. Some came for the saffron threads wound like silk, others for pepper sealed in cloth pouches, or for the healing mixture of clove and rose that eased winter coughs. His prices were fair, his humor measured, his debts few. That was enough for him. He often said to his neighbors that the world's balance rested in the beam of a scale. Neither side meant to rise too high. He worked from dawn to evening, always alert to the murmur of the bazaar, the sudden cough signaling a tax official's approach, the cry of a vendor advertising sumac syrup, the whine of a peddler's wheel. Each noise held meaning. The streets themselves spoke a language of small survival, one learned more by instinct than thought. He moved within it as fish move through water, cautious yet unconfined. Behind his stall lived the widow who sold dried fruits. Her baskets of figs and dates perfumed the air, their sweetness mingling with his spices until each fragrance borrowed from the other. They spoke little at first, exchanging only brief courtesies when passing. But over time, she began to leave a few figs beside his jars, in trade for a pinch of cardamom, and he pretended not to notice. She gave more than she took. Her laughter was rare, low and sudden, and once he caught it, he found himself waiting to hear it again. Life in the quarter followed the pattern of the seasons. Spring scattered green along the canals. Summer baked the alleys until stone itself flared with heat. In those months, buyers preferred dark tea and ground cinnamon mixed with dried rose petals. The blend cooled the blood, or so they claimed. He heard their talk and nodded, never contradicting belief, for every superstition had value when it crossed the counter. He kept a small drawing of Saint Haralambos pressed in a book, though he was no Christian, and a strip of blue cloth hung above the jars to guard against envy. In this city, faith and trade often shared the same shelf. One evening, after the bazaar closed, a sudden storm swept across the Golden Horn. Wind clattered through the slats, overturning scales, scattering spice dust that smelled of desert winds. When the rain ended, he found his roof torn, his merchandise soaked, and coins floating in the puddles like dull minnows. He sat until the floor grew cold beneath him. The following day, neighbors helped patch the gap, and the widow brought warm bread sweetened with honey. In that quiet, he felt gratitude so deep it embarrassed him. He was cautious with affection, uncertain how much he could offer without losing balance. The widow once told him that every kindness carried a weight, and not everyone could bear it. He thought of his own hands that had known labor but rarely another's touch, and understood too late what she meant. Their quiet understanding remained unspoken, a promise kept by distance. Months later, when her stall stood empty and rumors said she had gone to relatives in Scutari, he looked at the vacant doorway for days, listening to a silence that tasted bitter as unroasted coffee. The world soon filled the gap. Trade never slowed. Debts, favors, and prices moved with the tides. The merchant learned to keep ledgers cleaner than his conscience, every entry balanced, every bribe disguised as transport fees. He watched how officials carried themselves, how smiles gilded theft and signatures erased entire fortunes. Such sights taught him restraint. Yet behind this caution hid a deeper trust that others were not so different from him, that honesty, though dangerous, might still be found beneath layers of necessity. He took on an apprentice, a thin boy from Galata, who reminded him of his own beginning. The child's chatter filled the shop, and the merchant felt a gentle pride watching him measure cumin with exaggerated care. To teach someone the weight of a grain, to pass down a craft, this seemed, at times, more certain than prayer. He began to notice how his life unfolded in circles, pupil becoming master, laughter returning after long absence, fragility balanced by routine. On weekends he visited the harbor to watch the ships unload. Barrels of oil, bundles of silk, cages of songbirds, crates from Aden smelling of tar, all passed through the same hands that carried nothing home but dust. The spectacle never lost its pull. Standing among porters and foreign traders, he sensed both the magnitude of the world and his small place within it. He dreamed briefly of travel, but knew that a man who owned scales could not easily exchange them for a sailor's rope. The years left faint lines at his eyes, yet they softened rather than hardened him. He found joy in simple symmetry, in a customer's fair bargain, in the changing shades of daylight through jars of spice, in the silence that followed evening prayer. Still, a shadow lingered in him, the quiet fear of losing what small certainty he had built. Istanbul was a city forever threatened by fire, rumor, and greed. A merchant's life balanced always between survival and chance. One autumn, news spread through the market of a new tax. Officials came bearing stamped papers and bright seals, demanding payment for goods sold at harbor stalls. Many pleaded ruin. A few offered bribes wrapped in silk handkerchiefs. The merchant listened politely, counted what he owed, and paid without complaint. Yet that night he felt anger like spice caught in the throat. The rules of trade were meant to measure fairness, not submission, he thought. But in an empire of coins and decrees, fairness often proved the smallest weight on any scale. He began keeping his coins hidden in separate jars, marked only by scent, a blend of ashes in one, cardamom in another, so that only he could tell which held his savings. This small secret gave him comfort, the notion that the world's order could still be trusted to the senses, not to signatures. If he could read deception by smell or texture, he could survive it. Though he rarely spoke of dreams, sometimes, after closing the stall, he would sit by the window and imagined the widow among orchards across the strait. Perhaps she remembered his poor jokes. Perhaps not. The thought neither hurt nor healed. It simply existed, like the faint trace of spice that lingers on the air long after the jar is sealed. By late winter, he noticed his apprentice beginning to trade words too easily, promising discounts, praising poor-quality saffron. The merchant corrected him gently but firmly, telling him that trust, once cracked, cost more than any coin. This became his quiet creed, that a man's worth was weighed not by abundance, but by how evenly he held the scale between respect and self-preservation. On a rare, cold morning, as he unfolded the shutter, a merchant from the Armenian quarter stopped by with a battered chest. Within lay herbs of curious hue, pale and silvered, brought, he said, from Persia. Their fragrance was sharp, unfamiliar. The merchant inhaled and laughed, a scent both bitter and clean, reminding him of unknown coasts. They shared tea and traded knowledge. The meeting stirred in him a nostalgia he could not name, as if something old within him had been rained upon anew. By now, years had changed not only his trade, but his gaze. Where once he noticed the crowd, he now saw faces. Where he once feared the mighty, he now pitied them. He carried himself carefully, his tone humble yet assured. Beneath this calm remained the shy kindness of youth, hidden under layers of learning. Perhaps he carried too much tenderness for safety, but he had learned to hide it behind laughter, behind the light mockery that often rescues a man from revealing what he values. Evening fell. The call to prayer swept over the roofs, mingling with the rhythmic clang of oars returning on the tide. He rested against the doorframe, smelling the mixture of rain, salt, and spice that defined his life. The day's heat had passed. The weights were balanced, the jars sealed. Beyond the harbor, the lamps of ships twinkled like tiny eyes watching the city breathe. As the last customer's voice faded down the alley, he closed his stall with a quiet satisfaction. Another day measured, another debt forgotten. And though he did not yet know it, this calm would not last. Hidden within markets and ledgers, fates were already shifting. For now, he only listened to the sound of the wind in the eaves, scented faintly with cardamom and ash, and thought that perhaps this, for a merchant, was as close to peace as life allowed. A soft haze hung over the city that morning, turning the minarets along the Golden Horn into pale silhouettes. The air smelled of seaweed and tar, laced with faint sweetness from the spice bazaar. Caravans groaned at the edges of the port, their camels blinking drowsily in the thin light. The merchant paced between his shelves, sorting parcels, rinsing his scales in a small basin of rose water, unaware that his life, until then steady as a pendulum, was about to tilt. The clerk from the customs office entered with a polite bow, left a sealed receipt, and departed with the haste of one holding another man's burden. Only then did the merchant notice the line of Arabic written in an unfamiliar slant. From Mascate for immediate delivery. The name printed beneath was his own, yet he had ordered nothing from that far shore. Still, errors were common. Merchants often confused manifests, and every good trader knew that refusing cargo could invite suspicion. So he went to the quay to claim it. The crate was large, bound with iron bands, its surface crusted with salt. Laborers heaved it onto a cart, swearing under their breath about the weight. He paid the fee and rolled it to his workshop behind the bazaar. The scent of cloves seeped through the planks, rich and biting. When his apprentice, grinning with curiosity, pried the lid free, the first layer showed little more than spice packed in coarse paper. But when the merchant lifted one of the boards beneath, it gave way with a hollow sound, a false bottom. He froze. In that hidden cavity lay 3 small leather pouches, heavy and unmarked. He unwrapped one. Inside, uncut stones caught the lamplight, scattering dull crimson across his palms. Rubies, or near enough. His mouth went dry. Quickly, he replaced everything, pressing the planks back, hammering them as if to bury sound itself. He told the boy nothing. The apprentice noticed only that his master's hands trembled slightly as he wrote in the ledger. The day passed slowly, each customer's greeting pulling him from his inward fog. When the market closed, he barred the door and drew the curtains tight. The weight of the secret filled the room like unseen smoke. Night draped itself across the roofs, heavy with heat. He thought of the old lesson taught by his first master, that honesty, like any spice, must be measured carefully, lest it overwhelm the dish. If he took the jewels to the authorities, questions would follow, and questions cost silver. If he kept them, guilt would cost more. The crate stood in the corner like a silent witness. He poured himself water, fingers shaking, then put out the lamp and sat in the dark. The next morning he rose earlier than usual, hoping to convince himself it had been a mistake of the half-light. But truth greeted him plainly. The crate remained, sealed, accusing. He wrapped the top in new paper and stacked ordinary goods above to disguise it. His apprentice arrived, cheerful, speaking of breakfast and the price of lemons. The merchant nodded absently, each sound of the street echoing through his nervous pulse. Toward noon, 2 men stepped into the shop. One wore the gray coat of a harbor official, the other, a scribe with thin fingers stained by ink. They greeted him courteously, but their politeness had a measured chill to it. The officer asked after recent deliveries, requesting his register of goods. The merchant fetched it slowly, his mouth rehearsing an explanation he dared not speak. The clerk flipped through the pages, nodding, smiling. "We hear a crate arrived yesterday," the officer said, "from the port of Mascate." "Yes," the merchant answered carefully. "A mistake, I believe. The cargo was not meant for me." The official studied him with eyes like wet bronze. Then, perhaps satisfied, he closed the ledger and returned it. "Trade is prone to confusion," he said lightly. "Still, if another such error occurs, report it to our office at once." When they left, their silence trailed behind them like an odor. By evening, the harbor buzzed with unease. Word traveled that a junior customs clerk had been found floating near the docks, his chest slashed open, his purse emptied. Some said he had intercepted jewel smugglers. Others whispered of vengeance between trading guilds. The merchant listened from his doorway, his stomach leaden. The coincidence was unbearable. The crate's false bottom seemed to hum beneath his thoughts. Days stretched in wary repetition. He attended his stall, feigning calm, but his sleep grew shallow. In dreams, he saw the murdered clerk, face down in the water, one hand clutching a handful of peppercorns. Awake, he traced the same truth. Spice and blood sharing the same weight on this city's scales. Istanbul did not distinguish between the two for long. One late afternoon, as sunlight thinned over the rooftops, a man approached his counter. He was richly dressed, with a smooth voice and an accent that pressed Turkish words into small, foreign shapes. "You received a shipment by mistake," the stranger said quietly. "I've come to retrieve it." The merchant kept his face still. "Perhaps you should speak with the harbor office." "The office is no concern of mine. The crate contained goods for a trading consortium. Your name was used only for protection." The stranger's smile flickered. "We are grateful for your discretion." "And the clerk who was killed?" A pause. "An unfortunate debt. A personal matter." The merchant's scalp prickled. "The cargo is gone," he lied. The man regarded him coolly, then nodded, as if the answer held all he needed. "If you should find any remnant, burn it," he said, and disappeared into the crowd. For the rest of that day, the merchant could smell the stranger's perfume in the air, sharp as lemongrass, unsettling. By night, unease turned to resolve. He pried up the panels once more, removed the pouches, and tipped them into an empty spice sack. Then he left the shop and walked through narrow alleys to the shoreline. At the water's edge, lanterns burned on anchored boats, their light trembling across the ripples. He emptied the sack into the sea, hearing the faint clink of stones against rock. A quick final flash, then nothing. The tide swallowed the crime and its promise of fortune both. Returning home, he felt lighter yet uncertain, as if he had betrayed both greed and prudence at once. He slept without dreams, but the following morning the news spread faster than wind. Another man dead near the same quay, the same foreign trader, his throat cut in the dark. Some called it divine punishment. Others said the jewels had cursed all who touched them. Customers came and went that day with cautious voices. Even the scents seemed subdued, the aroma of cinnamon dulled by rain. The merchant served each buyer with his usual courtesy. Yet beneath his politeness lived a single thought, that silence too leaves its weight on the scales. He began writing his accounts with greater care, locking the ledger each night, though there was little left to hide. Toward dusk, his apprentice asked whether they would take new orders for the coming season. The merchant hesitated before answering, eyes lingering on the darkening harbor. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but only from those whose goods smell as they should." He shuttered the door and listened to the city settling into evening. Somewhere far below the surface, the jewels slept in their salt grave, and the sea carried no memory of them. Yet as he walked home, he realized that a trace of their chill seemed lodged in his chest, a weight that no tide could quite erase. Autumn arrived without ceremony. The air along the Bosphorus grew heavy with coal smoke and the damp odor of mulberry leaves pressed into the soil. The sea darkened each morning, restless with wind, and the alleys of the spice market turned narrow and gray under low clouds. Within that gloom, the merchant moved quietly, his gestures slower than before, his smile a little forced. People greeted him as they always had, yet he sensed their glances lingering. Istanbul's memory, he was learning, never forgot a whisper, especially one that smelled faintly of death and jewels. The affair of the crate had not vanished. A rumor persisted among the harbor men. that gold and rubies had disappeared into the sea, that someone had outwitted the customs officers, perhaps with friends in high places. To most, it was just another tale to fill the cold nights. But for the merchant, it remained an echo he could not silence. He sometimes felt that the weight of those jewels still pressed faintly beneath the floor of his shop. Trade faltered that winter. Ships came late, and many merchants found their accounts thinner than their hopes. Debts traveled faster than cargo. Bribes turned lighter, words sharper. The merchant took to walking after dusk rather than sit brooding behind his shutters. Those walks led him deeper than usual into the back streets near the tanneries, where the smell of iron and ash mixed with damp hides. Here the walls sweated rust, and stray dogs slept in heaps of wool. It was a district where authority seldom bothered to walk. One evening, beneath a flickering oil lamp outside a coffee shack, he met the Armenian herbalist again, the traveler he had befriended years before. Time had bitten into the man's hair, leaving silver at the temples, but his eyes gleamed with the same restless alertness. They greeted each other like men who shared an old trade more than a friendship. Over bitter tea, the herbalist spoke of strange disappearances. 2 dock workers gone without trace, merchants questioned, a ledger stolen from the customs storehouse. "Someone," he said, "is gathering proof of corruption." But proof is a thirsty thing. The merchant stirred his tea thoughtfully. "And those who drink from that well?" he asked. "Sometimes they choke," replied the herbalist, glancing toward the street. When they parted, the night seemed colder. The merchant's cautious nature wrestled with curiosity. His own misdelivered crate had clearly tangled with a chain of dealings far beyond spices, yet something within him, perhaps guilt, perhaps pride, compelled him to learn more. He began asking quiet questions of traders he trusted. Which harbor captains loaded their ships at night? Which officials rubber-stamped empty manifests? Most pretended not to know. Some hinted that the smuggling routes carried more than stones. They carried messages, gifts, even secrets, all hidden among cloves and pepper. Weeks passed. He discovered that the murdered customs clerk had been honest, too much so, and that honesty had drowned him. The magistrate responsible for investigating the case, a man named Rashad Effendi, was known for squeezing silver from silence. No one challenged his verdicts. Few dared utter his name aloud. Then one evening, while closing his stall, the merchant noticed a scrap of paper slipped beneath his door. The handwriting was fine, deliberate. "Your crate from Mascate. Do you still hold its ledger? Meet at the second arch of Valle de Han, sundown tomorrow." There was no signature. He folded the note several times before burning it in the lamp flame, but sleep remained as distant as forgiveness. The next evening he went, his steps uncertain. Under the shadowed arches of Valle de Han, merchants loaded goods by the dim glow of lanterns. Among them stood a veiled woman, older than youth but not yet marked by age, her posture firm. She addressed him without greeting. "You destroyed the stones?" she asked. "I returned them to where they belonged." She studied his face, perhaps weighing truth. "Then you still hold something. The ledger of the shipment. It lists the network. Bring it to me. I can reward what the Empire forgets to honor." "I am no judge," he said quietly. "Still, your hands opened the box. That makes you witness." Her tone softened. "Those stones passed through more blood than you wish to know. Bring me the ledger, and lives may be spared." Before he could answer, she vanished into the side alley, leaving behind the faint fragrance of musk and smoke. That night he reopened his oldest ledger, the green leather one from his apprenticeship. Tucked within its spine was the receipt from Mascot, creased and worn. He studied the markings, the strange initials beside his name. They matched merchant symbols he had recently seen scratched into barrels outside the customs warehouse. Each mark, he realized, corresponded to a trader he knew, men who dealt openly in spices, but in secret in other things. His pulse quickened with a realization that this small document, forgotten for months, bore the invisible signature of the entire conspiracy. The next days turned into a dance of indecision. The ledger lay hidden beneath his counter, every transaction above it suddenly suspect. Customers seemed to study him longer than necessary. The tinkling of the doorbells startled him into stiffness. Even the weight of coin against his palm recalled the chill of those jewels. Then, one dawn, came noise from the street. A raid near the docks. Soldiers marched through the alleys, their boots striking the paving stones like steady drums. The merchant stepped outside just as two officers sealed the door of a nearby shop. One of his acquaintances, an importer of coffee. The man protested until his voice broke. Later that afternoon, rumors leaked that the magistrate himself had ordered the arrests for smuggling gemstones and bribing port guards. The chain was tightening, though not around the guilty alone. By sunset, the herbalist appeared once more, breathless, carrying a small roll of parchment. "They keep lists," he whispered. "Anyone who handled the crate is marked. That includes you." "Why warn me?" "Because once they burn their ledgers, they burn witnesses next." They stood in silence, the smell of charcoal thick in the evening air. "That I must speak first," the merchant said finally. "But to whom?" "Not to the magistrate," replied the herbalist, a grim smile flickering. "He writes the script of the crime." The merchant did not answer. That night he thought of the veiled woman's words, "Lives may be spared." Perhaps there was still a way, if the truth could be turned loose before it was poisoned. But truth, he knew, rarely stayed pure once bartered. For several nights he kept to his stall after dark, pretending to count stock while the city slept. Through the lattice of his window, he watched men slip down alleys, their lamps hooded, their steps quick. One evening, a shadow hesitated near his door, a boy in ragged clothes. "For you," the child said, passing him a folded scrap before running. The note contained a single line: "The magistrate buys silence tomorrow at dawn." Beneath its words hung an empty seal of wax. He understood then that the veiled woman had allies even in the watch. Before dawn, the merchant left his house, carrying only the folded receipt and a packet of spices. He walked to the arsenal quarter, where the magistrate's coach often waited before the day's hearings. In the half-light, he slipped the parchment inside an envelope of ground cinnamon and ash, sealing it with his own mark. By the time the first call to prayer echoed, a messenger stood ready to deliver it, not to the magistrate, but to one of the Sultan's inspectors, recently returned from Adern. He returned to the market unnoticed. Customers came and went, trading gossip about arrests and taxes. The sun broke briefly through clouds, lighting the brass scales beside him. For the first time in months, the smell of spices filled the air without bitterness, until he lifted one jar of cloves and caught, beneath its sweetness, the faint tang of metal, the scent of iron. It lingered on his fingers, a reminder that even the cleanest hands, once they touch blood, remember. He washed them in rose water and said nothing. In the outskirts of the city, where the smell of salt faded and fields stretched toward the hills, stood a modest garden threaded with narrow irrigation ditches. The merchant came there not to trade, but to breathe. His work at the market had grown dangerous. The city's gaze, sharp as summer light on brass, followed him too closely. News drifted that the magistrate, Rishad Effendi, had fallen ill after a mysterious inspection by imperial auditors. Some said poison, others said disgrace. Truth in those days changed hands like coins, rubbed smooth by gossip. The merchant said little. He abandoned the stall to trusted apprentices and settled in a rented room beside the garden of a widow who sold herbs and fruit to travelers. She needed help tending the plants, and he craved anonymity. The barter suited them both. Each dawn he carried water from the well, while she picked mint and sage, stacking her harvest in small baskets for the road market nearby. Her home was simple, mud walls patched with straw, a cooking hearth blackened by years of smoke. Yet the air within held peace he remembered from childhood, when his world was smaller and the weight of decisions lighter. Beneath the pomegranate tree at the garden's edge, he often rested during midday heat. Its roots crawled deep into fertile soil, its fruit round and heavy. The splitting skins showed a glimmer of red that reminded him, unwillingly, of the rubies he had thrown into the sea. He tried to see them instead as signs of ripeness, not of punishment. Sometimes he wondered whether the sea had swallowed or preserved his sin. No man could measure what the waters forgave. The widow spoke little, and when she did, her tone lacked the guarded sharpness of city traders. She told him small things, the shape of clouds that promised rain, the curse of weevils in the barley sacks, the names of herbs that soothed the heart. Often she scolded the young travelers who came, smiling despite her words. The merchant watched her calm persistence and saw that, away from Istanbul's noise, survival followed gentler rules. Work, patience, decency, nothing more. He found small contentments there. Bread cooled on the windowsill, tea steeped in earthen pots with crushed cloves, bees circled lazily around the marjoram bed. In the evenings he walked along the ridge overlooking the Bosphorus, faint lights of the city blinking far below like scattered embers. He thought about the intricate web of deceit that had nearly trapped him, the magistrate, the smuggling ring, the deaths left unavenged, and felt them slipping from relevance, like forgotten debts in an old ledger. Yet peace holds its own unease. One afternoon, the widow's son returned from the market with news that soldiers had questioned merchants about ledgers and payments once again. Among the names mentioned was that of the spice dealer from Fatih, the merchant's own. The boy spoke the news casually, unaware that his guest was the man being sought. The merchant kept his expression calm, but that night he packed his few possessions and counted the coins he had saved. Sleep came slow. He had hidden the copy of his ledger between layers of parchment, uncertain whether to guard or destroy it. The document contained marks that no longer endangered him directly, but could expose the chain of corruption still unbroken. He sensed that the network had not died, only its faces had changed. To erase proof would be safe. To keep it might one day serve justice, though justice no longer seemed to recognize familiar voices. At dawn, he walked through the dew-soaked garden. The widow stood by the pomegranate tree, gathering fallen fruit. "You will leave soon," she said quietly, her eyes on the ground. He nodded. "My time here has been borrowed." She smiled faintly. "All time is borrowed, but the debt becomes lighter if paid with kindness." He wanted to answer, but words seemed fragile beside her truth. Instead, he bent to help her lift the basket. When their hands brushed, he felt the same warmth that once lingered over his stall when she had offered him honeyed bread years before. The touch passed, small and complete. He spent that day helping her son repair the garden wall. The labor steadied him. As he worked, he realized that fear and caution, though necessary for survival, had hollowed some part of him that kindness alone could fill again. In hiding his better nature, he had lost sight of its quiet strength. Perhaps that was what the jewels had demanded as payment, the dimming of decency for the illusion of control. At twilight, as the first chill crept through the air, a rider approached along the path. The horse bore no insignia, yet the man's posture was unmistakably official. He asked for directions to the merchant's stall in Fatih, explaining that the authorities sought information about the late magistrate. "There are new hands," he said, "who wish to set the books right." The merchant's mouth tightened. "The books are never right," he murmured. But he gave the directions and watched the rider disappear toward the city. That night, he sat beneath the pomegranate tree, the stars dim through a gauze of thin clouds. He could not tell whether fate was calling him back or offering escape. In the silence between the rustle of leaves, he heard only the pulse of his own conscience asking for use. The following week, travelers carried rumors from Istanbul. Officials had seized records from the treasury, uncovering payments linked to the very same routes from Muscat. "The empire's hands are washing themselves clean," one man said. Another laughed. "With salt water, perhaps." The merchant listened without reply. He imagined the papers, the tidy handwriting, the names written in neat columns, the ledgers that could damn a dozen men and still not fill the void left by a single lost conscience. In the fading days of early winter, he decided to leave for a while, to the villages inland where traders spoke slower and the laws traveled slower still. The widow's son helped load his single chest on a mule. Before departure, she pressed into his hand a small pomegranate, its skin unbroken. "For remembrance," she said, "and for luck, when luck matters." He thanked her, though he knew luck was only another name for timing, one that fortune borrowed from patience. The road climbed steeply, and beyond the hill, the city fell from sight. He did not look back. Weeks passed among the quieter markets of the countryside. There he sold herbs, ground spices, and small measures of olive oil, enough to live without claim or suspicion. People treated him as a man twice reborn, once by work, once by silence. In the slow rhythm of rural trade, afternoons stretched like unbroken cloth. Yet some evenings he still walked to the edge of the fields, where the wind carried the scent of the sea even from that distance. It reminded him that Istanbul never truly released its own. One evening, as he counted coins by lamplight, the pomegranate rolled off his table and split upon the floor. Seeds glistened like scattered rubies. He knelt, gathering them, and felt no unrest, only the quiet understanding that what once symbolized fear and guilt could now exist simply as fruit. He crushed a few seeds between his fingers, their juice staining his skin crimson, the same tint as the saffron dust that marked his youth. In that moment, he understood something final: that guilt, when carried long enough, ferments into wisdom. The world seldom offers absolution, but it sometimes grants clarity, the kind that ripens slowly, like fruit left on the branch until its skin cracks. He looked at his stained fingers and smiled, then wiped them clean. The wind moved softly through the shutters, blending earth and salt and a trace of iron that had followed him even here. Outside, the sky deepened into night. A thin crescent hung above the hills, pale as a slice of pearl. The merchant lay down, listening to the chirring of distant insects, his mind resting on the image of the garden. Somewhere far away, the widow might still rise before dawn to draw water from the well, her son filling baskets beside her. The thought carried warmth enough to quiet the darker parts of memory. He closed his eyes, and the scent that lulled him to sleep was neither spice, nor blood, nor sea, but the simple sweetness of pomegranate ripening in the cold air. When spring returned to the hills, it came quietly, with winds that smelled of dust and green shoots. The merchant had been living inland for some time, moving from one market town to another, his trade reduced to portable goods, saffron threads wrapped in cloth, crushed herbs, and small measures of pepper carried in sealed jars. He traveled light, spent less, and spoke little. Life had thinned itself to routine: unpack, weigh, bargain, sleep. Yet beneath that calm simplicity, something restless stirred. The kind of unease a man feels not from danger, but from unfinished duty. One afternoon, as he was preparing to pack for his next journey, a stranger arrived, an old messenger whose horse bore signs of long distance. The man carried a letter sealed with a faintly smeared mark of wax. It bore no name, only the symbol of a pomegranate flower. The merchant broke the seal in silence. Inside lay a short note, written in a woman's hand. "The magistrate is gone, but others write in his stead. Seek the ledger you once delivered. Truth requires witnesses." He read it twice, folding it carefully into his sleeve. The meaning was plain and heavy. Whatever corruption he thought buried had merely shifted form, perhaps sprouting new roots. And although he had long believed the ledger he sent to Istanbul had reached imperial hands, a new doubt crept in. Perhaps it had not. He felt that familiar tug between caution and conscience, the battle that had shaped much of his life. After a long pause, he decided that silence now would weigh more heavily than risk. By midsummer, he had returned to the seaside city. Istanbul shimmered in the heat, streets glazed with dust and light, the harbor thick with ships from Alexandria and Crete. The bazaar greeted him with its old roar, voices layering in myriad tongues, scales clinking, spices filling every fold of air. Only a few familiar faces remained. His shop stood under new ownership, its door freshly painted, though he recognized the old beam above the entrance and the faint stain on the wall where he once hung a blue charm against envy. He rented a small room above a candlemaker's workshop in Galata, overlooking the narrow waters between Old and New City. Each evening from that height he watched the ferries drift like gray birds as the sun burned low over the domes. He tried not to think of the past, but found himself tracing its outlines nonetheless. The mistaken crate, the drowned clerk, the veiled woman, the magistrate's cold smile. These memories refused to fade, held together by something more brittle than fear, the unfinished pattern of deceit that still haunted the city's commerce and life alike. It was not difficult for him to find whispers. A merchant learns to read talk by tone, not words. When he returned to the spice quarter, posing as a traveling supplier, he noticed that the ledgers of several traders were newly bound, their covers matching in thickness and binding. It was, habitually, imperial records that used such paper stock. But in these books, something more private had been written. Notes coded through weights and measures. A measure of saffron might represent a bribe, a shipment of cumin, a payment for silence. One evening, as the lamps of the bazaar dimmed, he met his former apprentice by chance, a grown man now, with the same quick eyes but a heavier gait. They spoke awkwardly at first. Two lives diverged by time and consequence. But over shared tea, the younger man admitted that the corruption at the harbor had returned with new figures. The magistrate replaced by his cousin, the same traders still buying favors, the same guards looking away at the right moment. "Some ledgers still bear your handwriting," the apprentice said quietly. "Your name marks the margin of truth they wish erased." The merchant stared at the rim of his cup. "Then truth has a poor memory. Or perhaps it hopes you will return to remind it." The words lingered like a reproach. In that moment, he sensed that his old role as witness had not ended when he left the city. It had only waited, like an unopened spice jar sealed too tightly. The question was whether opening it again would release fragrance or poison. Night fell quickly over the harbor. He walked through the alleys where traders locked their shops, the smell of cooling tar rising from the docks. Lanterns floated on the water where guards patrolled lazily. He realized that the ledgers still circulating must include the one he had marked years before, the same book that recorded false consignments under his name. Somewhere in a storage chest or archive, his written past continued its quiet whisper. He began to search through channels both honest and dubious. A clerk at the Treasury, long known for his appetite for coffee and gossip, spoke one evening under the buzz of flies and lamps. Yes, the ledger existed. It had been seized for evidence long ago, but never reviewed after the magistrate's death. Now it gathered dust in one of the stone storehouses behind the Imperial Customs Office. The clerk shrugged. "The record is blind until someone points its eyes." The merchant thanked him and left a pouch of pepper as courtesy. For a week, he pondered his path. To recover the ledger might expose too much. Not only the guilty, but the complicit, perhaps even himself. Yet to let it rot unseen would mean surrendering truth to decay. He decided to act, not as judge, but as honest trader settling an overdue account. He visited the warehouse after dusk, when the sea breeze carried the smell of burnt oil. Bribes were rarely needed if one timed arrivals between guards changing shifts. He slipped in with the routine of a man accustomed to the rhythm of doors. Inside, Rows of shelves towered like tombs, bundles of parchment, crates of seized cargo, unclaimed letters. Dust rose with each step, lit by slanted light from a high window. He found the document chest by its seal, a faded crescent stamped in blue. Within lay the familiar leather-bound ledger, green as tarnished copper. His own handwriting met him like a ghost. Margins held notes in code, numbers, names, abbreviations, once clear, now vague. Yet as he read, the pattern re-emerged. The routes of bribed ships, the officials' initials camouflaged as tariffs. It was proof more solid than rumor. He turned pages, half dreading what further truth might demand. Then he noticed something new. A final entry he had never written, dated after his departure. It listed a shipment sent under his name, yet described nothing but fragrant mixtures. Beneath, written in a hand unfamiliar but elegant, was a single phrase: "Weights at last are balanced." His heart tightened. Someone had added their confession, or their threat. Whoever it was had continued what he had begun, finishing the record of corruption, but leaving a message that blurred mercy with warning. Perhaps the veiled woman. Perhaps Rashad Effendi before his fall. Perhaps someone watching even now. He closed the book and replaced it slowly. To steal it would mark him as guilty. To leave it might condemn the city to forget again. For the first time he understood that truth did not need a savior, only endurance. The record, lodged among inert dust, would outlast its authors. That realization, oddly, freed him more than possession ever could. When he stepped outside, dawn had broken. Across the harbor, smoke curled from thousands of chimneys, winding into the first light like threads of breath. The city began to stir, vendors lifting awnings, fishermen calling out prices, the smell of baking bread cutting through the salt air. He paused near the steps that led to the water, the ledger's impression still lingering on his fingers. He felt tired, but certain. Whatever came next, he had already lived through the hardest bargain of all, the trade between silence and truth. Now he knew that both had value, though never at the same time. A man's task was only to choose which coin to spend, and when. He bought tea from a street vendor and sat watching the currents twist in slow circles around the pier. Steam rose from the cup into the morning chill, mingling with the city's vast breath. Somewhere behind him, guards shouted across the square, perhaps beginning another audit of papers and goods. He smiled faintly, knowing that the true ledger of any life was written not in ink, but in residue. On hands stained with spice, on memory, and on the small acts done without witness. The tea cooled, the sun climbed, and the day untangled itself from night. For the first time in years, he felt equal to the city's gaze, not above it, not below, merely part of its endless, breathing weight. Winter settled over the city like a wet cloak. The wind from the north pressed the waves hard against the stone quays, and the masts moaned night after night. Smoke from countless hearths drifted low, refusing to lift. The markets shrank to half their size. Doors closed earlier, scales lay idle in corners, and customers spoke in whispers. Istanbul had begun its season of listening. The merchant, who now rented his room above the candle workshop, kept mostly indoors. A small brazier burned beside his window, its coals fed by bits of dried olive wood. Each morning he watched fog rise from the harbor, veiling the outlines of ships like unsent letters. Beneath that quiet, however, the city stirred with rumors again. The investigation he had helped ignite months earlier had ripened into accusation, but not quite into justice. Some men had fled, others bribed their way into obscurity. The network he had exposed did not vanish, it merely shifted form, like smoke seeking another crack to slip through. He had accepted this with a mixture of fatigue and restraint. There are truths, he now believed, that must remain half-spoken to survive. He continued his trade at a slower pace, selling spice in smaller amounts, traveling less. The name he used in the bazaar was not his own. Yet he found the disguise unnecessary. People remembered faces for coin, not for conscience. One afternoon, while weighing saffron at his counter, he noticed a figure pause by the door. The man was wrapped in a plain cloak, his boots muddy from harbor streets. When he entered, the merchant recognized him as the old herbalist, wearier now, but his wit intact. They exchanged the careful greetings of those who have shared too much history. "They are burning papers," the herbalist said after a moment. "The new officials want a fresh order. They say the past only dirties the scales." "Perhaps that is true," the merchant replied, "but the weight remains, even after the ashes cool." The old man nodded, placing a small pouch of dried leaves on the counter. "Then let us speak no names. I came to tell you, the veiled woman is gone, taken by fever, or so they claim. Her son seeks her debts. I told him there are none." The merchant lowered his gaze. "May peace balance her accounts." "She left no ledger, only a message." The herbalist leaned closer. "It said, 'For those who carried the truth and did not profit, the city owes silence more than thanks.'" He smiled faintly at that, the kind of smile earned through weariness rather than joy. "Then silence it shall have," he murmured. That night, when the market emptied, he walked along the water. Crates floated near the piers, their labels blurred by rain. Somewhere among those wet scents of rope and hemp, he sensed the city's pulse. Fragile, but enduring. The smell of wood smoke mingled with cloves and damp silk. He realized that Istanbul, for all its ambitions, lived by the same rule as a trader's scale, balance achieved only through tension. Snow came a week later, dusting the ships and rooftops. The merchant found himself measuring time by the slow melt in the gutters. He no longer feared pursuit, yet the habit of caution persisted. He smiled at his own wariness, a trait older than guilt now. His humor had turned dry, but it kept him whole. Each morning he took comfort in small rituals, checking the brazier's embers, wrapping parcels with string, pressing seals into soft wax. Those gestures reminded him that not all stability was illusion. Sometimes the act of order itself resisted chaos. Then, without warning, the herbalist returned, this time pale and trembling. "They mean to arrest you," he whispered. "There are new accusations, that you altered records, that you profited from the jewel trade. I have seen your name written by a clerk's hand." The merchant exhaled slowly. Fear An old scent returned, sharp as myrrh. And what truth would they find now? Whatever suits them. He thought for a long while, fingers restless on the counter. If I flee again, it will name me guilty. If I stay, they may still decide I am. Then what will you do? Nothing, he said. The sea keeps its secrets. Perhaps I can keep mine. That night he prepared quietly. He left his coins behind, small payment for any who might claim the stall later, and carried only a cloth satchel containing ledgers, a few documents, and one sealed letter addressed to no one. When the streets emptied, he walked through alleys where the sound of the Bosphorus echoed like breath between tight lungs. The cold bit at his fingers. Still he continued until he reached the deserted quay where fishermen stored their nets. At the water's edge he paused. The city behind him glowed faintly, domes outlined by firelight. Ahead, the current shimmered like ink diluted by moonlight. Somewhere across that span lay other harbors where his name meant nothing. Yet he found he could not step onto any waiting boat. From the satchel he drew the sealed envelope. Inside lay a single page, his confession, simple, unembellished. It named no one, condemned no one, blamed neither greed nor empire. It spoke only of trade, how a man measures worth, how trust frays, how even the scent of spice can carry the taste of blood. He placed the letter within an empty spice jar and threw it into the sea. The jar sank slowly, twisting in currents before vanishing. A weight lifted. Not redemption, but the absence of hiding. He returned before dawn, unnoticed among the fishermen hauling their nets. The city soon brightened under a pale, almost forgiving light. At his shop he found nothing disturbed. Perhaps the threat had passed, replaced by some fresher scandal. Or perhaps silence truly had completed its purchase. The rest of the winter passed in monotony. Traders came for pepper, sugar, coffee. Officials inspected weights, then moved on. Once a guard lingered to comment on the merchant's honesty. The words amused him more than they pleased. Honesty, he thought, was a coin minted differently in each man's hand. One afternoon he discovered that his apprentice, the young man who had once warned him, had opened his own stall across the market. He visited unannounced, noticing the familiar orderliness of the jars, the same habit of labeling by scent rather than ink. When the apprentice bowed, uncertain, the merchant smiled. "Sell fairly," he said. "But remember, fairness is heavier than gold when carried too long." He left without purchasing anything, his steps steady on the worn stones. As he walked through the bazaar, the sound of barter filled the air again, voices haggling, laughter, curses, the eternal grammar of survival. By evening, snow began to fall anew, fragile as sifted flour over the city's roofs. He watched flakes melt on his sleeve, thought briefly of the ledger hidden in the treasury and the letter drifting beneath the current, both bearing fragments of the same truth. Some records, he realized, belonged to time alone. He closed his shutters early. The brazier burned low, the smell of cardamom rising into the chill air. He sat long after darkness thickened, content to listen to the muted noises of the street, the creak of carts, the clink of distant bells, the rhythm that told him the city, weary as it was, still breathed. In the silence between those sounds, the merchant felt something like peace. Not triumph or justification, only the steady quiet of a man who had weighed his life as carefully as he weighed spice, and found both slightly imperfect, yet balanced enough to endure. Evening unfolded slowly over the harbor, the kind of quiet light that blurs outlines and brings peace to worn hands. The merchant stood behind his modest stall again, though the stall was no longer the same, nor was he. The city had aged around him, its sounds softened by memory. The docks where soldiers once marched now swarmed instead with children running through crates. The voices of merchants rang familiar yet distant, their tones echoing the rhythm of lives that, like the tide, came and went without permission. His trade had become simpler. Gone were the ledgers and contracts written in careful ink. He measured spices by sight, weighed them more by habit than rule. Each morning he opened the shutters to the slow trickle of sunlight and arranged small jars along the counter: cumin, cinnamon, saffron, cardamom. The air filled again with that old warmth that first taught him patience. He found in this routine not profit, but balance, the kind he once sought in politics and intrigue, but never found there. People said he had grown quieter. He smiled more often, though his smiles came softly, as if kept under glass. He laughed when children asked the price of saffron, and then shrank from the number, his laughter not mocking, but affectionate. There was a comfort in these simple exchanges. He had become a figure of small renown, respected not for wealth or charm, but for the steadiness of his word. Few inside the bazaar remembered the man entangled in state affairs. Fewer still knew of ledgers hidden, of jewels drowned, or of confessions consigned to the deep. Time, it seemed, had granted him the greatest mercy: obscurity. Each evening, when the last customers left and the lanterns were lit across the harbor, he would brew tea in a dented bronze kettle, its handle polished by years of use. The spices mingled with steam, thick and comforting. Sometimes his apprentice, an eager boy with ink-stained fingers, would sit beside him, asking questions about trade routes or the lands from which the pepper came. The merchant answered sparingly, his words more like brief sketches than lessons. He had learned that wisdom, like fragrance, clings best when left faint. Once the boy asked if the sea was as deep as people claimed. The merchant looked up from his tea. "Deeper," he said. "Even when it sleeps, it keeps the memory of every ship it's taken." Then he smiled, as though at some private jest, and the boy, sensing secrets behind the answer, let the subject rest. Years had softened his edges, but not dulled his senses. He still marked each scent precisely: the sharpness of raw ginger, the heavy sweetness of tamarind, the earthy calm of myrrh. Each morning when fishermen brushed past, with nets still dripping, he inhaled deeply, grateful that the world still offered its familiar mixture of salt and spice. Life, for all its betrayals, had not stolen the gift of noticing. Beyond his stall, the city itself had changed its rhythm. Old courtyards had turned into warehouses, gardens into alleys. The wealthy grew wealthier, yet the poor still lit their lamps with olive oil and hope. From time to time news reached him of palaces in turmoil, of wars far inland, of treasuries emptied and refilled. Such tides no longer concerned him. He had once tried to balance great scales, only to learn that human hands are too small for such work. Better to measure what fits within reach: a fair spice trade, a modest living, a clear conscience. One afternoon, as the shadows lengthened and the calls of merchants grew tired, a woman approached the stall. Her veil was travel-stained, her manner uncertain. She asked for saffron, then hesitated, watching him closely as he measured the fine threads onto parchment. "My mother used to buy from a man who looked like you," she said. "She lived near Fatih long ago. She spoke of a merchant who helped her once when her husband died." He looked down at the scales, adjusting the weight carefully. "The city holds many faces," he said. "Perhaps mine only resembles his." "Perhaps," she agreed. But before leaving, she pressed an extra coin into his palm. "My mother said he was kind, that he refused payment for what he gave her." Then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. He turned the coin in his fingers. It bore a new sultan's seal. Different reign, same empire. Yet for the first time in many years, his eyes grew damp. The memory of a widow, a pomegranate garden, and the distant scent of mint rose like smoke through time. He slipped the coin into his pocket, not as payment, but as remembrance. As the season shifted toward autumn, he took to closing the stall earlier. Customers protested playfully, saying his saffron still sold quickest in the quarter. He answered that evening light flavored tea better than profit flavored the heart. Then he would pack the jars, wipe the counters, and step out to walk along the waterfront. The air carried the mingled smells of tar, roasting nuts, and sea. He would pause by the same pier each night, the place where he once cast his secrets into the water. The tide still moved there, indifferent but constant. He sometimes wondered what had become of the ledger in the treasury, of those names frozen inside it. The empire's bureaucracy had an appetite for paper, but no stomach for memory. Somewhere, perhaps in a damp archive, the record of his life's most precarious bargain waited unread, its ink fading, its importance long dissolved. The thought did not burden him. Some truths needed only to exist once to matter. Years slip faster in quiet lives. His hair thinned, his posture bent slightly forward, but his eyes remained alert. On cold mornings he wrapped himself in an old wool shawl, the same one he had worn since leaving the countryside. When the apprentice teased him, he would reply that warmth, like trust, should never be bought twice. One dusk he brewed a final pot of tea for the day. The harbor beyond his window flushed amber, every ripple holding the light like polished brass. He poured the first cup for his apprentice and the second for himself. They sat in silence, each watching the sky as it dimmed into shades of rose and gray. The boy broke the quiet. "Master, when you are gone, who will keep the stall?" "Whoever measures honestly," the merchant said. "The scales remember every hand that uses them. They only ask for balance." He looked at the glowing horizon, its warmth reflected faintly in the brass weights on the counter. "When you trade, listen not to the noise around you, but to the quiet inside. That is the true market." The boy nodded solemnly, though his youth could not yet grasp the weight of those words. The merchant smiled, half to himself, then refilled his cup. The scent of saffron rose faint and clear, carrying the memory of distant fields he would never see. Night eased in, soft as velvet. Lamps flickered along the shore, and the city murmured in familiar tones, bargains, laughter, prayer, and the endless shuffling of feet. The merchant pulled his shawl closer, feeling the warmth seep through his tired limbs. His thoughts drifted lightly, neither regretful nor proud, only full of the quiet satisfaction of a man who has lived enough to understand the limits of control, the worth of patience, and the slow, forgiving rhythm of time. Long after the young apprentice left, he remained seated by the counter, listening to the mellow hum of the sea, its voice older and wiser than all human traffic. Somewhere beyond that darkness, buried deep beneath salt and years, perhaps the jewels still rested, untouched, meaningless, yet glimmering for anyone who cared to search. He wished no one would. When the brazier dimmed to its last ember, he rose, closed the door, and whispered a small prayer, not of asking, but of gratitude. Outside, the muezzin's call echoed softly through the streets, folding into the hush of evening. The scent of saffron lingered in the air, warm and sweet, drifting outward from the little stall toward the sea, where light met shadow, and neither tried to outdo the other. In that calm hour, it seemed the city itself exhaled with him, and all balances, briefly, were kept.